USDA logo, United States Department of Agriculture.
Welcome to our Community Land Trust 101, a beginner's guide event. We're glad you could join us today. My name is Kristin Nelson. I'm the Senior Law Librarian at the USDA National Agricultural Library, or NAL, as we call it, and I am the coordinator of the Agricultural Law Information Partnership at NAL. The NAL building sits on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people. Please take time to consider the land you are on, actions that honor Indigenous people, and consider the legacies of violence and displacement that bring us together today. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal of Indigenous people from this territory. We realize that nations ceded significant portions of their land, forming present-day Washington, D.C. and surrounding areas in inequitable and unfair treaties. We honor and pay respect to the elders, past and present, and the future leaders. We recognize the need for the sovereignty of Native nations in this territory and beyond. At NAL, our mission is to facilitate the creation of agricultural knowledge through the acquisition, curation, and dissemination of information and data needed to solve today's agricultural challenges. Located in Beltsville, Maryland, NAL houses one of the world's largest collections devoted to food, agriculture, and related sciences. We are committed to contributing to the advancement of agriculture, and we are thrilled to have you join us in this mission. The Agricultural Law Information Partnership was established in 2014 and is a collaboration between NAL, the National Agricultural Law Center, which is part of the University of Arkansas system, and the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at the Vermont Law and Graduate School. The partnership connects consumers, legal professionals, and producers with agriculture and food law information. Now I would like to introduce Francine Miller, who will take over leading this discussion today. Fran is a senior attorney and adjunct faculty member at the Center for Ag and Food Systems, also known as CAFS, at the Vermont Law and Graduate School, where she supervises students in the Food and Agriculture Clinic, and she leads various projects as well. Fran predominantly focuses on farmland access, overseeing the expansion of CAF's Farmland Access Legal Toolkit to better serve historically marginalized communities, especially in the area of heirs property. Fran, I'll turn it over to you to introduce the other guests.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, and welcome everyone. I'm so excited about this webinar. I've been talking with colleagues about doing this for some time, especially with Kristin King-Reis, one of my key legal collaborators on land and farming, who you'll meet in just a moment. I want to thank the USDA, the National Ag Library, for hosting us and for all the support that they give to the Center for Ag and Food Systems, or CAFS, as we call it. So I'm going to say a couple of opening remarks, and then I'll introduce the panel. As Kirsten said, I work at CAFS, which is located at Vermont Law and Graduate School, and I get to work with law students on a variety of legal and policy issues, along with community-based organizations and with other academic institutions across the country. A fair amount of what I work on, as Kirsten said, can generally be called land access, which really entails trying to figure out how to get more of it, more access to land, that is, especially for marginalized or historically underserved communities, including Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and undercapitalized folks, i.e. people without wealth. I do a lot of outreach on and add content to a toolkit that CAFS created called the Farmland Access Legal Toolkit, which contains a ton of resources for farmers and landowners looking for legal educational information regarding accessing land. And we'll put some of the links to these things in the chat during the talk. Relevant to the topic at hand are pages in that toolkit on collaborative farming and on land trusts. And in addition to the work I do at CAFS, I'm on the board of Agrarian Trust, a national organization that supports local land projects involving community stewardship of land. And I'm also on the project team for a local project here in Tunbridge, Vermont, called the White River Land Collaborative. And That is also working hard to create a community-based collaborative land project where a nonprofit owns the land and provides land access to young farmers and land-based businesses. So with all these projects and others around the country that people speak to me about, people generally are working hard to hold land in common and practice community land stewardship, using a model that takes land off the speculative real estate market, that changes the way land is related to, and that supports farm viability by taking away the huge cost of land from farmers. More and more people are interested in addressing the issue of how our society, Western culture, capitalism, treats land as a commodity, as if it's a stock or an investment, something to be traded, to be capitalized, something to make money on. There are many, many people who've pointed out how problematic this can be, including many Indigenous leaders, academics, organizations. This way of relating to land can really impact negatively on rural communities in so many ways. And treating land as an investment, as many venture capitalists and other investment companies are doing, has a huge impact on land prices and is a major reason why buying land is so difficult for young farmers. So how do we create structures, legally and otherwise, that take land off the real estate market and make it more affordable for young farmers, especially for those without wealth and those who've been subject to systemic discrimination? Community land trusts are one tool that we can use. And for those of us who are focused on creating more spaces where there are commonses, where land and property is not owned by individuals, but by a local community, CLTs are really a proven tool, at least in the housing world. I don't have a lot of examples of CLTs holding agricultural land. So if any of you watching here have examples, please put them in the chat. We want to start collecting them. Today, you're going to hear from panelists who've been doing work in this field for so long about the basics of community land trusts, mostly in the housing context, as that's really where this tool has been put to use in the US for the most part. But we're eager to find examples of the use of CLTs in the context of land and farming, and are eager to expand the use of the tool in these arenas. So on that note, let me introduce our esteemed panel. We have a few slides that we're gonna use so that I can ask questions and we can briefly introduce the concepts and definitions around community land trusts. And I'll ask the panelists some questions and then we'll open it up to you for questions. So let me start by introducing Kristin. Kristin King-Reis and I have been brainstorming and scheming on land access and commoning issues for about 5 years now. Kristin is an attorney with a private practice focused on creating and stewarding permanently affordable homes and farms for people priced out of the traditional real estate market. And she represents CLTs in Washington, Montana, and Oregon, and serves as a legal consultant to nonprofits throughout the country, throughout the US. She's a writer and she has numerous publications, which you can see on her website at kingreisllc.com, which we'll put in the chat. Matthew Wyman, leads the Community Land Trust Institute for the Florida Housing Coalition and leads trainings and provides technical assistance to Florida-based nonprofits, local governments, community organizations on everything CLT, especially focused on housing. He also runs a training and certificate program, which he's going to talk about later. Last but not least, Matthew and his family have a micro farm focused on producing fresh market citrus, sweet corn, and chicken eggs. And then finally, Heather Benham has over 20 years experience in community development. Prior to joining Burlington Associates, she served as the executive director of the Athens Land Trust for more than a decade. Athens Land Trust is an innovative community and conservation land trust. We're going to find out the difference between those in a bit. that has developed over 200 units of affordable housing, renovated over 50 low-income owner-occupied homes, while also protecting more than 20,000 acres of land. So we'll be hearing more about the Athens Land Trust as we move into the presentation. All right, Jamie, will you put up the slides?
Yes, and while I do that, we have a couple poll questions that I'm going to launch while I get that ready.
Okay, great. All right, I hope people can see the poll. Folks filling out the poll. I'm not going to start until we finish this, Jamie.
Okay, can you guys see the slides okay?
Yep.
Great.
So glad to see you all here. Be patient. Jamie, you're still on the first question, yeah?
Yeah, sorry, give me just a second.
Okay.
We can go ahead and start. We'll ask the other one at the end when we're doing questions.
Okay. All right. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, Kristin, can you please talk to us about the beginnings of CLTs in the US?
Yes, thanks, Fran. Hi to everyone. I'm seeing a lot of familiar names, and Jamie and Kirsten, thanks so much for hosting this. And Matthew and Heather, I'm really glad that you're both here and always excited to hear what you have to say. The first CLT was New Communities, Inc., which grew out of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Leaders of New Communities, including Charles and Shirley Sherrod, among many others, we're looking for a way to solidify the gains of the Civil Rights Act of 1965 and also to provide Black farmers with greater economic and political independence during a time when they were being forced off the land in retaliation for registering to vote. In 1969, they formed New Communities in Albany, Georgia as, quote, a nonprofit organization to hold land in perpetual trust for the permanent use of rural communities. They, as the slide says, they purchased 5,000 acres of farmland and woods. And for the next 15 years, the community members lived, worshiped, ran businesses, and farmed on that land, producing and selling a variety of crops and livestock. But due to persistent discrimination, most notably being denied loans and subsidies that their white counterparts received, New Communities was not able to realize its goals. And by 1985, they lost the farm to foreclosure. While the earliest CLTs were rural and included a number of strategies to promote racial and economic justice, the action in the CLT world soon shifted into urban areas. And the focus for the past several decades has been primarily on creating and stewarding permanently affordable home ownership for low and moderate income families. There are some notable exceptions to that, but don't have time to get into that today. However, there's been renewed interest in the full scope of the CLT model. More groups are using CLT land for farming, commercial space, local businesses, parks, open space, and historic preservation. And there are a number of exciting partnerships evolving between CLTs and groups using a broad range of community economic development tools. This webinar is a testament to the increased interest, in particular in creating CLTs with farms and farmer housing. And just a final note on new communities: despite losing the original farmland, the organization has continued to work toward its goals, and today NCI owns and operates a place called Resora, a 1,300-acre community-controlled farm and retreat center. Next slide, please.
One question or just a thought about that. I think it's really important people look at, if you don't know about new communities, look into it. There's a couple of webinars or documentaries that show the history. Sorry. Yeah, it's a really important origin story that anybody who's interested in this kind of work should really understand. So look further at it. Okay, next question is to Matthew. Matthew, could you tell us about this slide? What's kind of the basic definition, and how do you talk about community land trusts and what they are?
Absolutely. I think within the context of this group, and thank you all for attending, it's important, as Fran mentioned, to really understand new communities as a mirror of where CLTs have came from, but also where CLTs could go, especially when we're talking about community ownership of land, not just for housing purposes, but also for creating food, growing food through livestock, fruits, veggies, etc. But the basic definition of a CLT, and this is primarily for the purpose of affordable housing, is that it is a nonprofit organization, which the primary purpose of the organization is to acquire and own land forever for the purpose of producing affordable housing. And dare I say, create a self-sustaining community could be one of those things that you might think to in the future as a basic definition of a CLT. But for right now, the focus is very much so on housing. Now, the key to the model, the CLT model, and being a best practice of the shared equity approach, which I'll get to in a second, is using shared equity, using shared shared ownership of land, which means separating the title of the land which is retained by the trust, and then administering a 99-year ground lease so that the improvements on the land can be owned by someone else, or someone else can have the right to use the land. Speaking very simply, we're talking about someone being able to own a home without necessarily having to pay for the land. This, of course, would promote affordability, along with this concept of shared equity, which is separate from shared ownership, where I just mentioned talking about separating title of land from improvements or a home. Shared equity is the concept of taking a one-time public investment or a community investment to make a home affordable for a low-income family. And here's the key piece: restricts the home's future sale price every time it's sold, so that it can stay affordable forever for future low-income families to be able to purchase it. Now, as Fran mentioned before, talking about utilizing land as a commodity and that sort of thing, this model can still allow folks to build wealth, especially for those folks who would not otherwise be able to afford to buy a home with the land, something that we as Americans are accustomed to. So we're really trying to promote through this CLT model this concept of community ownership of land, but we also are able to make homes affordable for folks who may not otherwise be able to afford a home in fee simple, as we say in the affordable housing community.
Great. One thing I forgot to let people know, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We'll collect them all and we'll answer questions towards the end. Okay, Jamie, will you advance the slides? Actually, before we go to this slide, Kristin, I wondered if you could just say briefly, what's the difference between a community land trust and a conservation land trust? Athens is probably a combination of both, as I said in the beginning, but I think it would be helpful just to say, what's the difference? You got to unmute.
Right, okay. The big differences are the mission and the legal tool. So the mission of a conservation land trust is to preserve habitat and or, assist endangered populations of animals to thrive. And their tool is called the conservation easement, which basically means that somebody buys the development rights so that the owner of the land can't develop on the land, and that it stays in its natural state to promote the mission. And that is not, with the owner of the land still has all the ownership rights except for development rights. Whereas a community land trust involves a ground lease. That's the legal tool. As Matthew said, you separate the land from the improvements, title of the land from title of the improvements. And so the community land trust actually owns the land as a nonprofit, and then they can enforce it through the ground lease, and they have their affordability controls in the ground lease.
Okay, great. Okay, we can go to the next slide now. Kristin, this is a question for you. I wanted to share with people a little bit of how community land trusts are governed. How does the community have a say? Who's a member? Who sits on the board? How does that all work?
Yeah, so there are two key features that differentiate community land trusts from other affordable housing organizations. And well, one of them is stewardship, ongoing stewardship, and Matthew's going to talk about that. And the other is community involvement, which is key. It's at the heart. The C is, the first letter in CLT. And the idea is that that the homeowners should have agency in how the organization is run and be involved in every part of the governing of the organization. So it happens at two different levels. There a lot of community land trusts are member organizations. So every homeowner automatically becomes a member, a voting member, and they have the right to give input at the annual meeting, and depending on the organization, various other types of input. And then the board itself, according to the model bylaws of CLTs, should be at least a third homeowners, so that homeowners have agency and are part of every step in the decision making of where to buy land, how to access land, building homes, qualifying homeowners, every part of it. And one thing that I want to say to people who are thinking about starting a CLT is that we do not have time to be in a hurry. So please, when you're starting, make sure that you reach out to everybody in the community who wants to be involved and should be involved, and bring them in to the conversation, even though it feels like it's going to take too long and it's messy. But like democracy, it ends up being an excellent way to actually have success going forward.
Great. I'm seeing a lot of really good questions in the chat, which we will get to. I just want to kind of get through the basics first. Next slide, please, Jamie. Okay, Matthew, this one's for you. can you just kind of take us through how this actually works? And we will talk more practically with Heather about the Athens Land Trust and how it works there. But this will be just some basics. So Matthew, this is for you.
Yeah, pretty simply, I think I kind of talked around this slide when I spoke last, but this is a visually impactful infographic that helps you understand that the CLT owns the land. An eligible home buyer comes to purchase the improvements, AKA the home. Yes, they end up paying a nominal ground lease to the CLT for essentially having the right to use the land as if it were their own. And that is the concept that we're talking about, not just simply you're renting something that somebody else owns, but that you have full right to use the land as if it were yours. And depending on the term of the lease, the concept is that the home would stay affordable for that period of time or longer, because oftentimes these leases are can be renewed, assumed, or something of that idea, so that the home can stay affordable for as long as possible, ideally perpetuity. That is, of course, the reason why the CLT model is used primarily at this time for affordable housing. So then when we talk about what happens at resale, in order for the home to stay affordable, that particular homeowner who now is becoming a home seller is able to sell the home, hopefully at a profit, but at a resale restricted value, depending on a formula that determines the price that they can sell the home at. The subsidy that can remain with the unit to keep it affordable would stay with the unit and is stewarded long-term by the CLT as part of its stewardship function. And the next buyer is able to afford the home because the price is restricted and they're not paying market price, because let's face it, a lot of folks cannot afford to buy a home at market, which is why a lot of folks don't have an affordable place to live. They're not able to afford their rent, or they're paying more than what they should. So that's really what the CLT concept looks like for home ownership. Yes, they're paying a lease for the use of the land, and sometimes that term is not 99 years. The term is not effectuated in law. However, it may be in your state. But what the real important thing to remember is where the loans for the home to be bought come from. The financial institutions, if they're selling them on the secondary market to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, they do have expectations and requirements that the lease be at least 30 years. The lease can also be, the home can be passed down to heirs, but it depends on what the particular CLT's ground lease speaks on that as part of the ground lease, because the lease is a legal instrument, as we mentioned before. So hopefully that's as clear as mud. If you want to learn more about CLTs, there's plenty of resources, but the best one that I feel like is out there is the one that we put on at the Community Land Trust Institute here in Florida. But you all are welcome to participate in our next go around, and there's more information on our website about that.
Yeah. And I'll ask you to talk a little bit more about that. Thank you for answering that question about the 99 years lease. I was going to ask about that, and inheritability as well. Before we move on to the next slide, Kristin, can you talk a little bit kind of theoretically about how this might look for a CLT that's managing agricultural land and being farmed? How, like, is it analogous, or are there differences? How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's been, part of what's been tricky about having farmland CLTs is that often you've got zoning restrictions, especially if you're in a rural agricultural setting, so that it's hard to do density, for housing on a farm in a rural area. Another issue that comes up is a lot of conservation easements have have sort of a clause that doesn't allow subdivision of the land, which means you can't do more than a single family home on it. You know, you'll typically have a building envelope and you're restricted on what you can put in there. But not only that, the owner of the land has to be the owner of the buildings. You can't separate it out. So while it's, you know, I've seen great work on getting community ownership of farmland for folks, it's harder to combine that with housing. And that's something that that Fran and I have been working on quite a bit at Agrarian Trust.
Yep. And with my local land project. Okay, next slide, please. Jamie, thanks. Okay, Matthew, this is for you. We wanted to talk about what does stewardship mean in the context of CLTs and affordable housing?
Sure. Stewardship is the most critical component, and it is what sets apart the community land trust model from other models that might employ some concept of preserving affordability. In this context, the land trust is, because they own the land, have a vested interest in ensuring that it remains available to the community for its primary purposes, but also for the benefit of the organization and all the folks who are part of it, including their members. Stewardship also applies to the people who consume or participate in what the CLT is doing through, you know, the housing component. A lot of first-time home buyers and a lot of homeowners fail to have the best understanding about the requirements of home maintenance and often defer those activities, creating a future problem. CLT can come alongside their homeowners and ensure that they are aware, proactively and retroactively, that they are aware of the things that they need to do to ensure that their home remains in good condition and will take care of them. That is one very particular example. Ensuring that the home remains affordable, meaning stewarding the that was provided the unit to make it affordable, making sure it stays with the unit, making sure it's not lost in the legal rigmarole of conveyance from one owner to the next is very important. Also, making sure that the resale formula is applied appropriately and every home buyer is paying what they're supposed to pay based on the formula that is established in that ground lease. They can also save a homeowner from default. Of course, being a primary purpose of a CLT is to ensure that homes are affordable. You don't want to necessarily lose a home that's been built with subsidy and the blood, sweat, and tears of folks who may be in the community. You don't want to lose that to the speculative market. So it's in the vested interest of the CLT to ensure people stay in their homes, or if they can't financially do so, to purchase those homes in order to ensure that it stays within that affordable housing stock within that community, and then of course sell that home to the next eligible buyer who may be interested in it. Ensuring homeowners understand the concept of home purchasing when it comes to a CLT model is very important. Community engagement to bring awareness to the model and how it can assist the community in creating housing opportunities to the benefit of its citizens is an important part of stewardship, as well as financial planning, so that homeowners in the CLT model have an opportunity to move up if they want to out of either a rental situation into community land trust homeownership, or from community land trust homeownership into fee simple homeownership, where they could also be owners and steward their own land. And that's what stewardship is all about.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, now we're turning to you, Heather. So we're going to talk with Heather about the Athens Land Trust and kind of CLT's as it's applied and to the extent that Athens has worked in the ag context. And
So just a little background. Athens Land Trust is 30 years old now, and it was formed as both a conservation land trust and a community land trust. So the mission from the beginning was to do both of these things. And a big focus of the conservation work was to protect and conserve farmland. And so over time, as we're developing housing and protecting farmland, we saw this need for something in between. And that became a community agriculture program, which then turned into all these things. And I'm not advocating that everyone turn into all these things, but I can just speak about these things because I've been through it. So one of the things that we did, incubator farm, then we created a farm access program to help folks that were graduating from the incubator farm access other land, either through affordable leases with landowners or on some of the protected farmland that we had. Community land trust housing. I'll show you in a second how that kind of looks. And then we had to create markets for our farmers because they weren't welcome with open arms into existing markets. And so we were creating different markets that were serving populations that sometimes had been left out of access to fresh and healthy food. So that's some of what it can look like. Now, if you go to the next slide, I'll show one of the things that we did. So Fran and Kristin have talked about how, there can be barriers and challenges. Like, you have this idea in your head that you want to create this wonderful farm that's got housing that's affordable for farm workers on the farm, but then it turns out you can't get loans or you can't subdivide or all the issues, right? So sometimes you have to come at it in different ways. So this is a project where we had a 5-acre woods in a low-income neighborhood in Athens that we had protected, 15 years ago. And it has trails going through it. It was something the neighborhood wanted and fought for. And so we worked with them to do that. And then 10 years later, 12 years later, this farm became available. It was the last in-town farm. So we were able to buy it with a mortgage and create it. And it's been all sorts of things. It's been a teaching farm. It's been incubator farm. It's been a CSA farm. But what it's grown into is the incubator concept where people are learning to farm, and we've created partnerships with outlets for them to sell, and then they can graduate off. And then we were able to get a hold of the property across the street, and that's where they're going to be developing the affordable housing so that you're getting around some of those barriers and restrictions by having it adjacent to, but not on the same parcel. So the point of this is, it's sometimes you have these, you're looking at it in one way, and it's hard to get past some of the barriers, but sometimes you got to step back and just give out, what do I actually have to do to get the same place without getting stopped? So if you go to the next slide. So this is, just want you to see, like, in practicality what the farm looks like. I mean, we're buying a bunch of dilapidated buildings and having to slowly over time fix up what we can. The idea was for the housing that was on the site, like long term, it could be farmer housing, it could be event space for the farmers and education space. The reality is we were having to rent out the buildings at market rate to university students to pay our mortgage so that we could lease the land for next to nothing to the farmers. And so it's just, you don't always jump from 0 to 100 in one big jump and get right where you want to go. The top right, we were able to fix that up, and the farmer lives in that, the farm manager. So, it takes time. I'm just trying to say, don't get discouraged. It is hard. And you can go to the next slide. Yeah, this is the part that I feel like what big takeaway is it doesn't always have to be exactly like you think. But that bullseye, the reason I have that there is one of the philosophies that I felt like was most important is the people who are most impacted by what you're doing should be the ones at the center of the bullseye that are having the most say in how it's playing out. And then you will have other people whose input matters. It's just maybe it doesn't matter. This sounds terrible to say, and it's hard to say to people, but I think it's important to just keep in mind, like, who are you serving? Who's the community? And to Kristin's point, you want to include everybody, but sometimes it's like, who's really being impacted? Who do we have to make sure is at the table in making the decision on this issue, and who may need to step back and not have such a loud voice in this conversation? So part of it. And so that's why these pictures, it looks like a lot of things. It looked like at one time, the young girl down at the bottom, it was summer camp program because that's what was needed during COVID. So that's how we used it. And that's, I guess one of the benefits of the land trust holding the land long term is that over time, it means that it serves the community in agriculture in different ways. So it's after school programs where it's youth workforce development where kids are getting paid to work on the farm because that's what they've said they needed as entry into jobs, and they want to learn about environmental jobs. Sometimes it's farmers using the space for workshops. It's taking young people in the programs to visit historically Black colleges and universities that focus on agriculture because that's what they wanted to see and be exposed to. So a lot of it's just listening and understanding what people are asking for and needing, and then figuring out the best you can how to use the land to meet those needs. So I think that's what I got.
Great. Thank you so much. I think, Heather, the thing you're saying a whole bunch of things that I think are really important, but one of them that the lawyers always say is that there's not one model that fits all, and that every project is really different. And you want these things to come from the ground. And as you're saying, responding to the community, listening to the community, what does the community that you're serving want?
Right.
Who's driving this? Who's talking? All of those things I think are just so important. And it's so beautiful what you all were able to do. The other thing I was thinking about your example is also the fact that you were a conservation land trust and a community land trust is so helpful, because when you said in that slide on the land where you showed the land, you were able to protect the Williams Woods, I think it was, or the 5-acre woods, whatever it was called. Protect, you mean protect, i.e. no development, like put a conservation easement on it, right? And you were able to do that because you were a conservation land trust.
Right.
And then you were able to also develop the homes as a CLT. So I love this example because it's such a hybrid and so developed from the ground. So thank you. Thank you for that. Jamie, I think we could take the slides down. A few questions that I have seen in the chat, which I think that we could just get to, and I'll kind of throw them out to the whole panel and whoever has some thoughts about this. One question was having to do with commercial space and CLTs. I don't know if you all have dealt with those issues. Anyone?
I haven't done it directly. I've worked with clients who are interested in doing it, and but I know that in Minnesota right now, there's a community land trust that's kind of an offshoot of City of Lakes. I can't remember what the name of it. Maybe Heather will remember it, but
It's people something, but yeah.
that is exclusively commercial spaces on CLT land. And then there's a group in LA that is working on having shared equity commercial space on CLT land, meaning not just that this land is being used for local businesses and leased out, but that actually the business owners own the building, own, you know, shares of the building or own the whole building. And I have been in touch with someone we're working on this ground lease, trying to get it figured out for commercial shared equity spaces. So stay tuned and be in touch if you have questions.
I've
Sorry.
also mentioned there's a very large land trust in Colorado and Denver that's been doing commercial space for a long time, mostly.
Elevation.
No, you made me think. It's Aaron Mirapol's group, and I'll think in a minute and I'll put it in the chat. But basically, they've been doing large scale developments where nonprofits are housed, schools are housed, health facilities are housed on CLT owned land. So it's been done, but just like you, Kristin, Burlington Associates, right now we've got several clients that are wanting to have the ability to do commercial land in their land trust. And so we're working through a lot of those questions that you're bringing up that have to be figured out to make sure that it all works, but it's coming. I think it's coming soon.
You're right. Is it the Urban Land Institute or anyway, we
Give me a
can
sec.
add it to our list of.
Yeah, we can add
resources.
it to our list of resources.
Great.
Matthew, anything on that or no?
For the sake of time, no.
Okay. Next kind of general topic is funding. So how do CLTs get funded? Are there lenders specific to lending to people who build houses on land that they lease? Is that a localized thing or is there a more of a national focus? Yeah, anything you have to say about lending and funding?
I guess what I would say is it's like any other nonprofit, you know, it's a challenge. It's a challenge to come up with enough money to bridge that gap between what's affordable and what the people you're serving can afford. And I wish it was a magic bullet for community land trust, but it's just like, honestly, all the others, you know, sometimes you can make a better case to fund it because it's going to be permanently affordable and it's over the long term, and because theoretically you're having the community involved and telling you this is what they need, and that's what a lot of funders want to hear. So and then lenders, it's a challenge too, but it's a education process, and there are folks out there that can help you. So once you get to a place where you need loans, I think it's definitely worth reaching out to people who are already doing that work and can help you connect to people that have been sold and are doing the work.
It's also important to clarify when you're talking about financial institutions, the difference between development funding and homeownership, like purchase funding. All financial institutions are not going to participate in either or both, but there are a growing number of institutions that offer programming specific to CLT homeownership or home purchases. And a lot of folks have programs that exist to assist in the development of units, but it may not necessarily be specific to CLT, but it is important to make the distinction on the financial side. So as I mentioned before, important to know some institutions utilize portfolio money. That means their own money to fund CLT or shared equity related projects and home purchases. Some institutions sell the loans that they make to Fannie and Freddie. And so of course that means that there's standards that need to be met for that to transpire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in Vermont, people have said to me that, and this wasn't people in Vermont who said it, it was I don't remember what state they were from. They did a lot of work in their state to educate local institutions, local finance institutions, banks and credit unions and that sort of thing. And they were suggesting that if we wanted to pursue, and there is obviously CLTs in Vermont, but in our local area, it might be worth it to just talk to our local banks and local credit unions and literally educate the financial folks there about CLTs, which was so, I don't know, there was something about that that was funny to me. Like we would have to educate them. They're the financial people, but they don't
No.
know about CLTs.
No, that's absolutely true. And bringing to light the encouragement through the duty to serve plans that Fannie and Freddie Mac have to put forth to the Federal Housing Finance Authority in to help meeting the need on this particular subject and just in general, supporting the efforts to grow the home ownership rate, diversity, inclusion, and all those sorts of good buzzwords. But those are the plans that you may want to look at, the trickle down effect. But education is paramount. That's why we at the Florida Housing Coalition and specifically the Community Land Trust Institute find it to be our primary purpose to educate folks on this particular model, because the more people who understand the model, the less naysayers there will be. And probably there'll be a lot of benefits to some of the data that people talk about, like, increasing the home ownership rate.
Mhm.
Every size doesn't fit all, and that's not just a term that attorneys use to make sure that they have business.
Thank you.
That was a joke, not serious, everybody. Don't start coming off mute screaming cuss words at me, at least not because of that.
A follow-up question on that. Kristin, I know that you just published something, a resource about cities and CLTs, and there was a question, and maybe it goes along with this financing question as well, about like, are there city CLTs? Are there cities that own land and then issue long-term leases to homeowners or farmers even? And how does that play in here?
There will be, thanks for asking that, Fran. Yes, there is a focus report, a policy report that just came out that John Davis and I co-authored, and it is primarily aimed at policymakers at the municipal level to just inform, like you were saying, you have to educate the financial folks and the government folks and the lawyers, everybody. And that will be in the list. There'll be a link to that in the list of resources after the call. And then as to, yes, there are cities like the city of Irvine, runs their own CLT. When I'm asked, my advice is that you try to get the CLT to be an independent entity for a lot of reasons. The biggest one being that often the homeowners are not centered when it is a city-run CLT. There's also subject to political, shifts in political interest, and so funding can disappear and then they get neglected. And there's a case that happened in Denver where a city legacy project for permanently affordable homes ended up losing hundreds of homes to their portfolio just because of a change in politics and lack of funding. So yeah, I think it's worth collaborating with your city, your local municipality, and hoping to get funding from them and making things easier on the permitting side and zoning. But I advise against having city-run organizations.
Okay. Another question that came up was somebody asked something about anti-corporate farming laws and whether they prevent CLTs, because so these are, for those who don't know, there's, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 states, mostly in the Midwest, that have enacted laws that limit how much corporations can own farmlands. They've been hacked away at by corporations, and in some states, more of them remain, more of the restrictions remain than in others. But it is often the case that nonprofits are exempted from those laws. So you really have to look at the law in your state to determine that. I will say that I worked on a piece of legislation with the National Family Farm Coalition anti-corporate farming piece of legislation to address this issue of land being used as investment, which if you go to NFFC's website, you'll see a whole lot of resources on that. And that legislation was introduced by Cory Booker in the last legislative session. We'll see what happens now. And we did exempt nonprofits from the restrictions. You all have anything to say about that? Kristin, Heather, Matthew? No, okay. Matthew, I want to make sure to give you a minute to talk about your certificate program. You want to do that?
Sure, I'm going to make it quick because I got a super hard stop in I was going to say 3 minutes. But although the Florida Housing Coalition is a statewide nonprofit organization that is, all things affordable housing and assisting local governments and nonprofits enhance and improve their programs around that subject, we recognize that there is a growing need across the United States, especially in the southeastern states where, let's face it, I did see in the chat, Grounded Solutions Network mentioned as a great resource for CLT, the CLT model. However, they don't have capacity to help everyone across the country to establish or enhance operations when it comes to the CLT model, or even educate the folks at the level that we're talking about today that would be very helpful in moving affordable housing, specifically permanently affordable housing, forward. So the CLT Institute operates a training and certification program in tandem with a technical assistance and organizational certification program on pretty much all things community land trust, specifically to affordable housing, as well as bringing to light some of the other approaches to produce permanently affordable housing. So if this topic of community land trust sparks your interest and you want to learn more about it, this particular program is not exclusive to the folks in Florida. There's quite a few CLTs sprouting up every month here since prices have been driven up into the stratosphere. But the program is offered to anyone who wants to participate. I did drop plenty of information in the chat, including the website link. And I think that'll also be in a handout. And hopefully sometime very soon, you'll get a toolkit. But if not, we'll make it available on our website for you all to take a look at. Thanks for that time.
Thank you, Matthew. All right. I guess we're coming up on 3 o'clock, but I just have a really brief question. Do you all see that CLTs are becoming more popular? And is there one place that people could go to find whether there's CLTs in their area?
Yes, they're definitely becoming more popular. That I can say that without a doubt. And I have found, so Ground Solutions has a mapping program that's maybe a little out of date. The place that I felt like I saw more current information was, and Kristin, you're on the board, so I need you to say the name.
I'm not on the board, but I am a collaborator of theirs. The International Center for CLTs website has a map. We just did a survey last fall, so it's relatively up to date. Yeah.
Thank you.
Say the name of that again.
The International Center for CLTs. I think
Okay.
that's on the list.
Yeah. It used to be called the Center for CLT Collaboration or something like that. But anyway.
Yeah.
Thanks, Matthew. All right, it's 3 o'clock. There's still a bunch of questions which Jamie will collect, and we'll see what we can do about answering some of them. We're going to send out that PDF that she put in the chat. So if you have a hard time getting it out of the chat, we'll send it out after. We'll send a link to the recording. We're hoping that this is kind of part 1 of more. There's obviously a lot of interest in this topic, both on the housing and the land side. And Kristin and I are constantly scheming about these issues. If anybody is, wants to do that on a legal / practitioner level, please be in touch.
And Heather too, Heather's.
And Heather, yes, I'm sorry. And
Yeah.
Heather, 3 of us. Thank you, USDA National Ag Library. We'll be in touch.
USDA is an equal opportunity provider, employer, and lender.